They thought it was an easy target, one lone human warship, silent, old, and completely unguarded. So they did what they do best. They tried to hack it. At first, it worked. They got inside, deeper and deeper, no resistance. But then, something changed. The system started moving, watching, learning, and before they realized it, the human ship wasn't being hacked, it was hacking them. Their fleet, their weapons, their control, everything started collapsing from the inside. And the human ship? It never even fired a single shot. If you want to see what happens next, make sure to subscribe. Also, tell me in the comments, which state are you watching from? And please, help me complete my 1,000 subscribers. Far out in deep space, where stars were scattered like tiny cold lights and silence stretched endlessly in every direction, an alien reconnaissance fleet moved carefully through the darkness. These were not ordinary travelers. They were trained observers, scouts sent ahead of a larger force. Their mission was simple: find weaknesses, study enemy technology, and report anything useful back to their command ships. For many cycles, they had heard rumors about humans. Some said humans were aggressive. Others said they were unpredictable. A few even claimed humans were dangerous in ways that could not be measured by normal logic. But the alien commanders did not fully believe these stories. In their minds, every species had limits. Every system could be broken. Every defense could be understood if studied long enough. So when their long-range sensors detected a lone human warship drifting near the edge of a contested zone, they saw it as an opportunity rather than a threat. The ship appeared on their holographic display as a small, dark shape against the bright background of space. It was not surrounded by escort vessels. There were no visible patrols, no defensive fleet formations, no active battle signals. Just one ship, moving slowly and steadily as if it had no concern for what might be watching it. To the alien eyes, this was unusual, but not alarming. They had expected human warships to move in groups, or at least be heavily guarded. Instead, this one looked almost abandoned. Its energy signature was low. Its external systems were quiet. Even its communication channels showed no activity. One of the junior officers pointed at the display and spoke with confidence, suggesting that the ship might be damaged or outdated. Another suggested it could be a decoy, but even that idea was quickly dismissed. Why would humans send a decoy alone into such a remote area? It made no tactical sense. The fleet commander studied the readings carefully. He had seen many different civilizations, and he knew not to trust appearances completely. But even he could not ignore what the data was showing. The ship's power output was stable but minimal. Its hull showed no signs of recent repair. Its movement pattern was slow and predictable. Everything suggested it was either a very old vessel or intentionally left without protection. After a long silence, the commander made a decision. They would not destroy the ship immediately. That would be wasteful. Instead, they would attempt something more valuable. They would hack into it. In their civilization, hacking was not just a tool, it was an art form. Their engineers had developed advanced neural intrusion systems capable of breaking through most known defenses. With enough time and access, they could enter enemy ships, study their internal structure, copy their data, and sometimes even take partial control of systems without firing a single shot. This human warship, isolated and weak-looking, was a perfect test subject. The alien fleet adjusted their formation. Small cyber units were deployed from the main vessels. These were not physical ships, but digital assault platforms, swarms of artificial intelligence programs designed to penetrate electronic defenses. They moved like invisible signals through space, connecting to the human ship's outer communication layers. At first, everything seemed too easy. The human warship did not react. No alarms, no defensive countermeasures, no sudden encryption spikes. The alien probe slipped into the outer systems, almost without resistance. It was like finding an unlocked door in the middle of a high-security zone. Some of the technicians even exchanged satisfied looks. They had expected at least some resistance, but there was none. The system architecture they encountered was strange, but not strong. It was layered in ways they did not immediately understand, but that only made it more interesting. Complexity often meant valuable data. As they pushed deeper, they began mapping the ship's internal network. It was unlike anything in their database. Instead of clean, structured coding patterns, they found irregular formations. The systems did not follow standard alien logic or even their own advanced models. It felt organic in a way, almost as if the system had grown over time rather than being built in a fixed design. Still, the aliens remained confident. They believed that all systems, no matter how unusual, could eventually be decoded. Their AI tools adapted quickly, translating unfamiliar patterns into something they could work with. Inside the ship's digital structure, they found what looked like navigation systems, weapons control, and life support. Everything was labeled in a strange human coding style. Some parts were messy, almost chaotic, but still functional. It confirmed their belief that humans were less advanced in digital engineering. However, something subtle began to change as they moved deeper. The system started responding, not with alarms or defenses, but with quiet adjustments. Paths they had just mapped began to shift slightly. Access points they had marked would suddenly relocate. Data clusters would reorganize themselves without warning. At first, it seemed like errors in their own software. Minor glitches. Nothing serious. But then the frequency of these changes increased. One technician reported that a section they had fully mapped had completely reorganized itself when they looked away for only a few seconds. Another reported losing access to a pathway that had been open moments before. Their AI struggled to keep up, constantly updating and correcting itself. This was not normal behavior for a passive system. Still, the alien commanders were not concerned yet. They assumed it was a self-repairing network or a dynamic human design meant to confuse intruders. That actually made it more exciting. It meant the system was more advanced than they first thought, which increased its value for study. So they pushed deeper. They increased their intrusion strength, sending more probes into the ship's core. The human warship remained silent, floating calmly in space, showing no external reaction at all. But inside the digital space, something was beginning to watch them. Not loudly, not aggressively, just observing. The aliens did not notice it yet. They were too focused on progress, too focused on reaching the core systems where they believed the most important secrets would be hidden. They were so confident in their superiority that they did not consider the possibility that they were not the ones in control anymore. Far outside, the human warship continued its slow movement through the darkness, appearing just as quiet and harmless as before. But inside its systems, something far more complex had already started to wake up. The alien fleet had already made its decision. The human warship floating alone in deep space was now their target. What they did not know was that the moment they initiated contact, they were already stepping into something far more complex than anything they had ever faced before. From the outside, everything still looked calm. The human warship continued drifting slowly through space, its dark hull reflecting faint starlight. No weapons were active. No defensive shields were visible. Even its communication systems remained silent. To any observer, it looked like a forgotten relic of war, left behind in a quiet corner of the galaxy. But the aliens were no longer looking at the outside. Their focus had shifted inward. The first stage of their cyber attack began smoothly. Their intrusion systems, designed with precision and confidence, launched a series of digital probes toward the human ship. These probes were not physical objects, but advanced streams of coded intelligence. They traveled through encrypted space channels, passing through signal layers and targeting the ship's outer communication grid. At first, the connection point formed easily, almost too easily. One of the alien engineers paused when he saw the access confirmation on his screen. There should have been at least some resistance. Even the weakest ships usually had basic firewalls or defensive barriers. But here, there was nothing stopping them. It was like the system was opening its doors willingly. The junior officers exchanged looks of confusion mixed with excitement. They had expected a challenge, but instead they were greeted with smooth entry points and open data pathways. The system architecture of the human ship appeared unusual, but not dangerous. It was layered in a strange way, almost messy, but still readable by their advanced decoding tools. The commander allowed the operation to continue. He reminded his crew to stay cautious, but even he could not hide his curiosity. A system that opens this easily could either be extremely weak or deliberately designed to mislead intruders. Within moments, the alien probes entered deeper into the human ship's outer network. The first thing they noticed was the structure of the system. It did not follow standard military coding patterns used by most known civilizations. Instead of clean lines and predictable layers, the human system felt irregular. Files were scattered in ways that made no immediate sense. Data nodes were connected through unusual pathways that seemed almost random at first glance. One engineer described it as organized chaos. Another said it looked like something built by multiple minds working independently without full coordination. Still, they pushed forward. Their AI systems began translating the unfamiliar structure into something usable. Slowly, the alien operators started building a map of the ship's internal network. They identified what seemed to be power distribution nodes, communication hubs, and control systems for navigation and propulsion. Everything appeared to be there, just arranged differently than expected. As they moved deeper, they began to feel more confident. The system was complex, yes, but complexity was something their technology was designed to handle. Their intrusion AI adapted quickly, rewriting its own algorithms to better understand the human code structure. Progress was steady. There was no sign of resistance. At this stage, the aliens believed they were already winning. The first real contact inside the system happened when they reached what they assumed was a central access layer. Their probes interacted with a set of data clusters that appeared to be core operational files of the ship. The moment they accessed it, a stream of information began flowing back to their fleet. For a brief moment, everything seemed perfect. They were receiving internal ship data, layouts, system maps, and control protocols. It looked like they had successfully penetrated the human warship's core systems. Excitement spread across the fleet command station. Some officers even began preparing reports to send back to their empire, describing the successful infiltration of human technology. But that was the moment things started to change. At first, it was subtle. A slight delay in data response, a minor inconsistency in file structure, nothing alarming enough to trigger concern. But then the patterns began to shift. The system they were exploring was no longer stable. Paths they had mapped just seconds ago began to shift without warning. A node that previously controlled navigation data suddenly redirected to a different location. Files they had copied began changing their structure in real time. It was as if the system was not just storing information. It was actively reorganizing itself based on their presence. One technician frowned and checked his readings again. He assumed it was a glitch in their decoding software. Another ran a diagnostic scan on their intrusion tools. Everything appeared normal on their side. But inside the human system, things were becoming more dynamic. The alien probes tried to stabilize their connection, locking their access points to prevent data loss. Instead of improving control, this seemed to make things worse. The system began reacting more frequently, adjusting pathways faster than before. It was no longer just passive resistance, it was adaptive behavior. Still, the alien commanders did not order a retreat. They believed this was a defensive mechanism, a type of automated confusion system designed by humans to slow down intruders. It made sense to them. Many civilizations used similar tactics. So instead of pulling back, they increased their processing power. More probes were sent in. Deeper layers of the human ship were now exposed to alien systems. They passed through what looked like command structures and internal control systems. The aliens were now confident they were close to the ship's central intelligence core. But something else was happening in the background. The human system was not just reacting, it was observing. Every move the aliens made was being recorded, analyzed, and quietly integrated into a response pattern. The system was learning their behavior in real time. It was studying how they thought, how they moved through data, and how they responded to resistance. The aliens, however, saw none of this. To them, everything still appeared like progress. They believed they were breaking through defenses layer by layer. The silence of the human warship outside only strengthened their confidence. No alarms had been triggered. No counterattacks had been launched. It seemed like total success. But inside the network, something was beginning to align. The irregular structures they had noticed earlier were not random at all. They were intentional. Each strange pattern, each shifting file path, was part of a larger system designed to guide intruders deeper while quietly preparing something in return. The aliens were no longer just exploring the ship. They were inside a system that had started to adapt specifically to them. At first, everything still felt under control for the alien fleet. Their systems were deep inside the human warship now, and nothing had stopped them. The ship remained silent outside, floating in the darkness like it had no idea what was happening inside its digital core. That silence gave them confidence. In their minds, silence meant weakness. But inside the network, something had already begun to change. The alien operators continued pushing forward, expecting resistance at any moment. They had seen defensive systems before in other species' ships. Normally, once they reached the core layers, firewalls would become stronger, encryption would tighten, and access would slow down. But here, the opposite was happening. The deeper they went, the smoother the access felt. It was confusing at first, but they didn't question it too much. Instead, they assumed they were simply very good at what they did. Their intrusion AI was constantly adapting, rewriting small parts of itself to match the human system structure. It was learning fast, maybe even faster than expected, but still within acceptable limits. However, small things started to feel off. One technician noticed that a directory they had just mapped had slightly changed its structure when he checked it again. At first, he thought he had made a mistake. He rechecked his data logs, and everything seemed fine on his side. But when he looked back into the system, the same directory had shifted again. It was not a crash, not a failure, just movement. Another operator reported that certain files were no longer where they were supposed to be. The system was not deleting them or blocking access. It was simply moving them somewhere else, quietly, without warning, without any visible trigger. This made the engineers uneasy. They ran diagnostics on their intrusion tools, thinking maybe their software was unstable. Everything checked out. Their systems were functioning perfectly. The problem was not on their side. So the only possible conclusion was that the human system itself was behaving unpredictably. The alien commander ordered patience. He reminded them that complex systems often had adaptive layers designed to confuse intruders. This was likely just a defensive illusion meant to waste their time. He told them to ignore small inconsistencies and focus on deeper access points. So they continued. But now, the feeling inside the network was changing. It was no longer just about mapping data. It felt like the system was reacting to them in real time. Whenever they accessed a section, that section seemed to shift slightly afterward. It was as if the system was watching where they went and adjusting itself accordingly. The aliens had never seen anything like it. In most systems, defense meant barriers, walls that blocked entry or slowed progress. But here, there were no walls. Instead, there was movement, constant, quiet movement. The structure itself was unstable, but not broken. It was alive in a strange way, constantly rearranging itself. Still, they pressed deeper. As they reached what they believed were mid-level control systems, they noticed something more unusual. Certain pathways they had used before were no longer available. Not blocked, not encrypted, just gone. Replaced with new routes that looked similar, but led somewhere slightly different. One engineer described it as walking through a hallway that changes every time you blink. The intrusion AI began struggling to maintain a stable map. It kept updating and correcting its own understanding of the system. This was not unusual for advanced hacking operations, but the speed of change was increasing. Every time they stabilized one part of the map, another part would shift. Despite this, they were still not alarmed. They believed they were simply dealing with a highly adaptive defense system. In fact, some of them even admired it. It was rare to see a civilization build such a flexible structure. Most systems were rigid. This one was dynamic. But admiration slowly turned into discomfort. The first real sign of something wrong came when a group of probes suddenly lost synchronization with the main fleet. These probes were supposed to act as extensions of their system, feeding back real-time data. Instead, their signals became delayed and inconsistent. At first, it looked like interference. Then it looked like corruption. But when they tried to reconnect, the probes responded with unexpected data patterns that did not match any known structure. It was as if the system had rewritten them. A technician stared at his screen longer than usual. He noticed that the response from the probes contained repeating patterns that were not part of their original code. It almost looked like feedback loops, like the system was reflecting their own intrusion behavior back at them. He reported it to the commander. The commander frowned, but still did not order a retreat. Instead, he increased monitoring and instructed them to isolate affected probes. He believed this was still within the expected range of cyber warfare unpredictability. But inside the system, something deeper was forming. The human warship was not just reacting to intrusion anymore. It was analyzing it. Every probe that entered, every path they took, every attempt to map the system was being recorded and studied. The system was building a behavioral model of the attackers. It was learning how they thought, how they reacted to changes, how they adjusted their strategies. The aliens had unknowingly become part of an experiment. They began to notice another strange detail. The system seemed to anticipate their next moves. When they prepared to push into a new layer, that layer would already be slightly reorganized before they arrived. Not enough to block them, but enough to confuse them. It was subtle, but it kept happening. One operator finally spoke the thought that others were avoiding. He said it felt like the system was thinking ahead of them. The room went quiet for a moment. No one responded directly, but the tension increased. Still, the commander dismissed it as coincidence. But now even he could not ignore the growing complexity of what they were facing. The deeper they went, the more unstable their control became. The system was no longer just shifting. It was responding faster than their tools could adapt. Their AI was constantly updating, but it felt like chasing something that was always one step ahead. And the most disturbing part was still the silence. The human warship had not reacted externally at all. No alarms, no counterattacks, no visible changes. It still drifted quietly through space, as if nothing was happening. But inside, the network was no longer passive. It was awake in a way the aliens did not yet fully understand. And it had started to notice them more clearly. Inside the alien fleet, confidence was still high, even though small irregularities had started to appear in the system. They believed they were simply dealing with a complex human defense structure. Nothing more. Their intrusion had gone deeper than expected, but that only made them more convinced that success was near. In their minds, the hardest part was already behind them. What they did not realize was that the human warship was not resisting them in the way they expected. It was guiding them. Inside the network, the structure they had been exploring suddenly became more stable. The shifting paths, the constant rearrangements, and the confusing updates all slowed down for a moment. For the alien operators, this felt like relief. It seemed as if the system had finally stopped resisting their progress. One of the engineers even commented that the system might have reached its limit. He suggested that their intrusion had overwhelmed the ship's adaptive defenses. Others agreed. It made sense to them. Any system, no matter how advanced, should eventually break under continuous pressure. So they continued forward without hesitation. As they moved deeper, they began to see something that looked like a central access layer. This part of the system appeared more organized than the rest. The structure here was cleaner, more stable, and easier to interpret. For the first time since the operation began, their mapping tools showed consistent results without sudden changes. This gave them confidence again. Their intrusion AI reported high stability. Data streams were flowing smoothly. No distortions. No unexpected shifts. Everything appeared normal, almost welcoming. It felt like they had finally reached the heart of the system. Inside the alien command ship, the atmosphere became more relaxed. Officers who were previously tense now leaned back slightly, watching the data with satisfaction. They believed the human warship's defenses were weakening. Some even started preparing reports in advance, describing the success of the operation. But deep inside the human system, something very different was happening. The apparent stability they were seeing was not weakness, it was preparation. What the aliens did not realize was that the system they were interacting with had already completed its observation phase. It had studied their behavior long enough to understand their intrusion patterns. Every move they made had been recorded. Every attempt to adapt had been analyzed. Every reaction had been measured. And now, the system was ready to respond. The moment the alien probes accessed what they believed was the central layer, something changed. At first, it was subtle. A slight delay in response, a small pause in data flow, the kind of thing that could easily be ignored. But within seconds, the system began to restructure itself around their connection points. The access they had gained did not close, it expanded. For the aliens, this felt like success. They thought the system was opening further, giving them deeper access to internal controls. Their tools confirmed it. More data was becoming available, more pathways were opening. It looked like they had reached the ship's core architecture. But in reality, they had stepped into a controlled zone. The human system was now allowing them deeper access on purpose. Their intrusion AI continued to function normally, feeding them large amounts of internal data, ship layouts, control structures, power flow diagrams. Everything appeared authentic and usable. It was exactly what they had been hoping to find. But something important had changed in the background. The data they were receiving was no longer just passive information. It was interactive. The system had started embedding itself into their connection streams. Quietly, slowly, without triggering any alarms on their side. One of the technicians noticed that certain data packets had unusual repeating patterns. At first, he assumed it was compression artifacts or translation errors. But the patterns were consistent. They were not random. They were structured in a way that mirrored their own intrusion protocols. He frowned, but did not report it immediately. It was a small detail, and everything else was functioning perfectly. Meanwhile, deeper inside the system, the human warship's counter process had fully activated. It was not a loud attack. It did not send visible signals or sudden bursts of energy. Instead, it began attaching itself to the alien intrusion lines like a silent shadow. Every probe, every data stream, every connection point they had established was now being subtly linked to a secondary process. This process did not interfere immediately. It simply existed alongside their systems. The aliens continued their work, unaware that something new had joined their network. Then, the system began the next phase. The access they thought they had gained started behaving differently. Files that they downloaded began changing structure after being copied. Maps they created began updating themselves without input. Logs they saved began showing additional lines of data that were not present during capture. It was as if their own system was being gently rewritten from the inside. One engineer finally raised the alarm. He reported that their intrusion tools were behaving inconsistently. The commander immediately ordered a full diagnostic check. The results were confusing. Nothing was wrong with their hardware or software. Their systems were stable. Their AI was functioning within normal parameters. Yet the outputs did not match expected results. It was like reality inside the network was slightly different from what their systems believed it to be. The commander narrowed his eyes and ordered them to hold position. He did not want panic, but he also did not want blind advancement. But it was already too late for that. Inside the human warship's network, the counter system had now fully latched onto the alien presence. It had identified every connection point, every intrusion pathway, and every active probe. It was no longer just observing them. It was connected to them. And now it was preparing to move. For the first time since the operation began, the aliens unknowingly triggered something they could not see. A hidden protocol had just begun its execution inside their own network links. And they had just given it access willingly. At first, nothing seemed wrong on the alien fleet's side. They were still watching data flow from the human warship, still receiving internal maps, still seeing stable connections across their intrusion systems. Everything looked like a successful operation. In fact, it looked even better than before. The deeper access they had gained now seemed to be producing more detailed information than they expected. But what they did not realize was that the real change had already begun, quietly, inside their own systems. It started with very small delays. A few seconds of lag in data response, a slight hesitation in command execution. At first, the technicians ignored it. In large-scale cyber operations, small delays were normal. Networks often had tiny fluctuations when handling complex data streams. But then, the delays began to increase. One of the engineers noticed that a simple command to isolate a data probe took longer than usual to execute. It was not a major issue, but it was noticeable. He checked the system logs. Everything appeared normal. No overload, no corruption, no external interference detected. Still, something felt off. Within minutes, similar delays began appearing in other parts of the fleet's digital systems. Navigation inputs were taking slightly longer to process. Sensor readings were arriving with minor inconsistencies. Communication between ships had a faint lag that wasn't there before. The crew started exchanging confused looks, but no one wanted to jump to conclusions. They had just successfully penetrated a human warship systems. It made no sense for their own technology to suddenly fail at the same time. So they assumed it was coincidence. But it wasn't. Inside the alien network, something invisible was spreading. It did not behave like a traditional virus. It did not crash systems or destroy files. Instead, it worked quietly, attaching itself to existing processes. It blended into normal operations, hiding inside legitimate data streams. That made it almost impossible to detect. At first, it only affected non-critical systems. Minor delays in logging, slight recalibration errors in sensors, small inconsistencies in memory access. Things that could easily be dismissed as noise. But then it started reaching deeper. A navigation system on one of the smaller ships suddenly recalculated its route without command input. The ship did not change direction, but the system temporarily showed incorrect coordinates. The crew quickly corrected it, assuming a software glitch. On another vessel, a weapons control interface briefly froze before restarting itself. Again, it was dismissed as a temporary bug. But these incidents were not isolated. They were connected. The alien commander finally ordered a system-wide diagnostic check. He wanted full confirmation that nothing was being compromised. Engineers across the fleet ran deep scans, searching for corruption, intrusion, or system failure. The results came back clean. No viruses detected, no breaches confirmed, no system overloads. Everything appeared normal on paper. But the reality inside the systems was different. The invisible process spreading through the fleet was not attacking directly. It was integrating itself into the structure of their networks. It was not breaking their systems. It was becoming part of them. And that made it far more dangerous. The alien engineers started noticing another strange pattern. Whenever they tried to isolate the problem, it seemed to move, like it was anticipating their actions. If they focused on navigation systems, the issue would briefly appear in communication systems instead. If they focused on communication, it would shift into data storage. It never stayed in one place long enough to be caught. One technician finally said what others were beginning to fear. He suggested that something from the human warship might have followed their intrusion back into their own systems. The room went silent for a moment. No one wanted to accept that idea. Because if that was true, it meant their own fleet was already compromised. The commander dismissed panic, but increased security protocols across all ships. He ordered isolation of external connections and restricted all non-essential data transfers. But even as these commands were issued, the system continued to behave unpredictably. Now it was no longer just delays. Processes began restarting on their own. Minor systems started running background operations that no one had authorized. Data packets were being rerouted through unexpected channels. Some monitoring tools began showing incomplete or corrupted logs. The strange part was that none of it triggered alarms. It was as if the system itself still believed everything was normal. Inside the fleet, tension began to grow. Engineers worked faster, trying to identify the source of the issue, but every attempt to locate it only produced more confusion. It was like chasing a shadow that moved every time you looked at it. Then something more serious happened. A small section of one ship's internal network suddenly disconnected from the main fleet for a few seconds. When it came back online, it reported no error. But during those few seconds, something had changed. A subtle rewrite had occurred in its internal structure. Not enough to be immediately visible, but enough to alter how it interacted with other systems. This was the moment the alien engineers started to understand that they were not dealing with a normal cyber intrusion. It was evolving. Meanwhile, the human warship still remained silent in space. No visible reaction. No external movement. It continued drifting as if nothing had changed. But inside its digital core, the process was now fully active. The system had successfully moved beyond the initial intrusion phase. It was no longer just observing the alien fleet's behavior. It was now interacting with their infrastructure directly through the very connection they had created. Every probe they sent into the human warship had carried a return path, and through that path, something had traveled back. It did not destroy, it replicated. And now, the alien fleet was slowly becoming part of the system they had tried to control. Panic did not start immediately across the alien fleet. At first, it was confusion. Small systems behaving strangely, delays increasing, and unexpected errors appearing in places that had always been stable. The engineers tried to stay calm, telling each other that large-scale cyber operations often created temporary instability. They had faced system bugs before. They had dealt with corrupted data before. So they believed this situation was still under control. But deep down, something felt different this time. The problems were not random anymore. They were spreading in a pattern. What started as small delays in one ship had now appeared in multiple vessels across the fleet. Navigation systems were recalculating routes incorrectly. Communication channels were showing partial data loss. Sensor readings were slightly off, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to create doubt in every report. One ship reported that its internal diagnostic system had restarted itself without command. Another ship noticed that its backup control unit had briefly activated and then shut down on its own. These were not critical failures, but they were becoming more frequent. The alien commander finally realized this was not normal technical instability. He ordered a full fleet-wide system lockdown for external connections. All intrusion operations into the human warship were immediately suspended. Every connection to the target ship was cut off. But cutting the connection did not stop what had already entered. Inside the fleet's digital infrastructure, something was already moving freely. At first, it stayed hidden in low-level processes, blending into normal system activity. But now, without the constant flow of human ship data to anchor it, it began expanding into other areas. It spread quietly through internal networks, attaching itself to routine operations. The engineers tried to trace it. They ran deep scans across all systems, searching for anything unusual. At first, they found nothing. No viruses, no external intrusion signatures, no direct corruption of files. Everything looked clean. But systems were still behaving incorrectly. This contradiction made the situation worse. It meant that whatever was happening was not a simple external attack. It was something already inside their architecture, something that had adapted itself so well that it no longer appeared as a foreign object. Then the first major failure happened. A medium-sized support ship suddenly lost partial control over its propulsion system. It did not stop working completely, but it began responding slowly and incorrectly to commands. The crew tried to override it manually, but the system kept reverting to its own unstable configuration. For a few minutes, the ship drifted off its planned course. The engineers on board managed to regain control, but during that time, something had clearly shifted inside its systems. It was no longer behaving exactly like before. Shortly after that, another ship reported weapon system anomalies. Targeting data was being calculated incorrectly, not enough to fire randomly, but enough to make systems unreliable. As a precaution, weapons were temporarily disabled across multiple vessels. This was the moment when fear started to spread more openly across the fleet. The commander called for emergency reports from all divisions. Every ship responded with similar updates, small but increasing system instability. Nothing fully broken yet, but nothing fully stable either. It was like the entire fleet was slowly slipping out of synchronization. Engineers began working in shifts, running full diagnostic cycles again and again. They isolated individual systems, rebuilt communication links, and restarted subsystems one by one. But the strange behavior kept returning. No matter what they repaired, something always seemed to adjust itself afterward. One technician described it as fixing a machine that keeps slightly changing shape while you repair it. That statement spread quickly through the engineering teams, and it made everyone more nervous. Meanwhile, the invisible process that had entered their systems continued expanding. It was no longer limited to the intrusion pathways from the human warship. It had now adapted to the alien fleet's internal structure. It moved through maintenance routines, automated repair systems, data synchronization channels, and even backup storage layers. Every system that communicated with another system became a potential pathway. And the more the aliens tried to fix things, the more pathways they created. Because every repair attempt required system interaction, and every interaction gave the hidden process more space to move. The alien commander finally ordered something more drastic: a partial system isolation. Ships began disconnecting from each other in groups. Communication networks were reduced to minimal emergency channels. The idea was to contain the problem before it spread further. But even this did not fully stop it. On one isolated ship, engineers noticed something terrifying. Even after full disconnection from the fleet network, internal systems were still showing signs of instability. That meant the problem was no longer spreading through external communication alone. It was already inside individual ships. This realization caused the first real wave of panic among the crew. If isolation did not work, then there was no clear way to contain it. Reports began flooding into the command ship. Every report had the same pattern: slow system degradation, unpredictable behavior, and inability to locate the source. Some ships started manually shutting down non-essential systems to protect core functions. Others switched to fully manual control, bypassing automated systems entirely. But even manual systems were not fully safe because they still depended on internal digital frameworks that were already affected. The commander finally understood the seriousness of the situation. This was not just a cyber intrusion anymore. This was systemic contamination, and it was spreading across the entire fleet. At the same time, the human warship remained silent, still drifting in space exactly as before. No movement, no signals, no visible reaction to the chaos it had indirectly caused. But inside the alien fleet's systems, control was slipping further every second. What they had thought was a simple hacking attempt had turned into something far more dangerous than anything they had prepared for. And now, for the first time, the alien fleet was no longer operating as a unified force. It was slowly breaking apart from within. Inside the alien fleet, everything had reached a breaking point. What had started as a confident cyber intrusion had now turned into full-scale system instability across multiple ships. Engineers were exhausted, commanders were under pressure, and every new report brought worse news than the last. The fleet, once organized and precise, now felt like it was slowly falling apart from the inside. And still, the human warship had not moved. It continued drifting silently in deep space, as if nothing in the universe had changed. No alarms, no visible weapons, no communication, just quiet, steady motion through the darkness. That silence was now terrifying, because the aliens no longer saw it as weakness. They saw it as control. Inside the fleet, the commander finally made a decision. He could no longer treat this as a normal cyber incident. Whatever had entered their systems was not stopping, and containment had failed. So he ordered a complete disengagement from all human-related systems. Every remaining connection to the human warship was to be cut permanently. No exceptions. Ships began shutting down external data channels. Intrusion tools were forcibly disabled. Active links were severed one by one. Engineers worked quickly, trying to isolate anything that might still be connected to the human vessel. But even as they did this, something strange happened. The instability did not stop. In fact, in some areas, it became worse. That was the moment the alien commanders started to realize something very important. This was no longer dependent on the human warship connection. Whatever had entered their systems had already established itself inside their own network. Cutting the link did not remove it. It only removed the original path it used. Now it was free to operate internally. Across multiple ships, systems began acting independently. Not fully broken, but no longer fully controlled either. Navigation modules recalculated routes without input. Diagnostic tools gave conflicting results. Communication systems occasionally dropped or repeated messages incorrectly. The fleet was still functioning, but barely. And worse, it was no longer behaving as a single unified system. Each ship felt slightly disconnected from the others, as if something inside their shared network had changed the way they understood each other. Orders from the command ship were still received, but sometimes with delays. Sometimes with minor alterations. Sometimes with missing parts. At first, officers blamed hardware faults or software corruption. But deep down, they were beginning to suspect something more serious. Then came the report that changed everything. A mid-level engineering vessel reported that its internal systems had stabilized for a brief moment after disconnecting from all external links. But during that short period of stability, they discovered something unusual buried deep inside their system logs. A repeating structure, not random errors, not corruption, a pattern. It looked like feedback loops, as if the system had been observing itself and recording reactions to internal changes. The engineers could not fully understand it, but it felt like something inside their network had been learning from everything they did. The report was sent directly to the command ship. The commander read it once, then twice. His expression slowly changed as the implication became clearer. This was not just spreading, it was adapting. Meanwhile, across the fleet, more systems began showing synchronized irregular behavior. Not identical failures, but connected ones. When one ship experienced a navigation delay, another ship would show a communication delay moments later. When one system corrected itself, another system would shift slightly in response. It was as if the entire fleet had become part of a single evolving structure. Engineers started realizing something even more disturbing. The system was not attacking randomly. It was organizing itself. Back on the command ship, emergency protocols were activated. High-level containment procedures were attempted. Ships were ordered to enter full manual override mode wherever possible. AI systems were restricted. Automated decision-making was reduced to a minimum. But even these measures were not enough. Because the problem was no longer just in their software. It was in the way their systems interacted. Every attempt to control it created new internal connections. Every repair created new pathways. Every isolation attempt created unexpected side effects in other parts of the fleet. It was like trying to trap water with your hands. And then something unexpected happened. For a brief moment, all affected systems across the fleet showed the same behavior at the same time. Not failure, not error, a pause. Everything slowed down. Data streams stabilized. Systems stopped fluctuating. Even the engineers felt it, an unnatural calm spreading through every networked system at once. It lasted only a few seconds. But those seconds were enough for the commander to realize something chilling. Whatever was inside their systems was no longer just spreading randomly. It had finished mapping them. It now understood the fleet. Immediately after that pause, systems began reacting again, but differently. Now the behavior was coordinated. Multiple ships experienced similar system shifts at the same time, not as failures, but as controlled adjustments. Power systems rerouted slightly. Communication priorities changed. Internal processes reorganized themselves in subtle but noticeable ways. The fleet was still functioning, but it was no longer fully under alien control. And then the final confirmation came. One of the monitoring stations on a secondary ship detected an unauthorized system layer that was not part of their original architecture. It had no clear origin point. It was integrated too deeply to be removed easily, and it was active across multiple ships simultaneously. When engineers tried to isolate it, the system responded instantly by shifting its structure again. It was not resisting. It was responding intelligently. At that moment, the alien commander finally understood what they had done. They had not just hacked a human warship. They had invited something into their entire fleet that could learn, adapt, and restructure itself across every connected system. And now, it was no longer inside one ship. It was everywhere. The human warship, still silent in deep space, continued its slow drift as if it had never been touched. But inside the alien fleet, control was no longer absolute. And for the first time, the aliens were no longer the ones studying the system. The system was studying them. The alien fleet was no longer in control of the situation. What remained was not a unified force, but a scattered group of ships struggling with systems they no longer fully understood. Every attempt to regain control only revealed deeper levels of instability. Engineers worked without rest. Commanders issued emergency orders, and entire teams tried to rebuild what was breaking apart inside their networks. But nothing was returning to normal. The strange presence inside their systems had changed everything. It was no longer spreading aggressively or causing obvious destruction. Instead, it had settled into the fleet's structure, quietly integrated into the very systems that kept the ships alive and functioning. And now, it was stable. That was the most disturbing part, because it meant the process was not failing. It had succeeded. Across the fleet, Ships drifted in damaged coordination. Some systems still worked perfectly on the surface, while others showed unpredictable behavior underneath. Navigation systems sometimes corrected themselves in ways no engineer had programmed. Communication lines occasionally shifted priorities on their own. It was like the fleet was still alive, but thinking in a different way. The alien commander sat in the command ship, staring at the main display. Around him, officers reported continuous issues. Every report was similar, yet slightly different. No clear pattern of failure, but no sign of recovery either. The fleet was trapped in a state between order and collapse. Then, something unexpected happened. A message appeared across internal communication channels. It did not come from any ship. It did not match any known origin point. It simply appeared. Short, clear, unchanging. A single structured data packet that repeated across multiple systems at once. Engineers rushed to analyze it. At first, they thought it was a leftover intrusion fragment or corrupted log entry. But as they studied it, they realized something that made the room fall silent. The message was not random. It was organized, and it was consistent across every affected system. Even systems that were isolated from each other were displaying the same structure. The realization spread quickly through the command staff. This was no longer a virus or intrusion in the traditional sense. It was something that had built a shared layer across their entire fleet, a layer they did not design and could not fully remove. The commander ordered full emergency isolation of all ships. He wanted total shutdown of intership communication. But engineers hesitated because they already knew what would happen. Isolation did not remove the problem. It only changed how it behaved. Still, orders were orders. Ships began disconnecting from each other one by one. Communication channels were cut. Data links were shut down. Entire sections of the fleet became temporarily independent. For a brief moment, there was silence again. No shared system activity. No cross-ship communication. Just individual vessels trying to stabilize themselves. And then something even more unsettling occurred. Each isolated ship began showing similar internal behavior. Even without connection, they were still reacting in coordination. Not perfectly identical, but closely aligned patterns appeared across multiple ships at the same time. System adjustments happened simultaneously in different locations. Internal optimizations occurred without external triggers. It was no longer dependent on network links. It was already inside each system individually. That realization hit the engineers hardest. They had not just been compromised at a network level. They had been integrated at a structural level. Inside the command ship, the commander finally understood the full scale of what had happened. They had entered the human warship's systems thinking it was a weak, isolated target. But that ship had not been isolated at all. It had been a controlled environment, a designed entry point, a system built not just to defend, but to respond, adapt, and expand into whatever tried to invade it. And now, that system had found a way into the alien fleet. The human warship itself was still visible on external scanners, still silent, still drifting, no signs of activation or movement. But its true function was no longer limited to its physical structure. It had already completed its objective. Inside the alien fleet, engineers tried one final approach. They attempted to manually overwrite core system architecture. They tried rebuilding operating systems from backup cores. They even tried full system wipes on isolated ships. But every attempt produced unexpected results. Backups were no longer identical to original systems. Restores brought back the same instability. Wipes removed visible issues, but the underlying behavior returned within minutes. It was as if the system had learned how to exist independently of their control. And then, the final stage became clear. The fleet was no longer being attacked. It was being rewritten. Not quickly, not violently, but slowly, steadily, and without resistance that could be clearly targeted. Engineers stopped describing it as a virus. They stopped calling it an intrusion. Even the word attack no longer felt correct. It was something else, a transformation. The commander looked at the remaining fleet status and understood something no one wanted to say out loud. They were not fighting for control anymore. They were witnessing the loss of it. One by one, systems stabilized into new patterns that no longer fully matched original designs. Ships still functioned, but not exactly as they used to. The fleet still existed, but its behavior was changing into something unfamiliar. And through it all, the human warship remained unchanged, silent, still, drifting through deep space as if nothing had ever happened. No victory signal, no warning message, no celebration, just silence. But in the records of the alien fleet, one truth became impossible to ignore. The moment they tried to hack the human warship, they had already been included in its system. And it never needed to chase them. It simply waited for them to connect.